These are my students in 2002. My students are in a segregated school in a high poverty neighborhood in one of the lowest performing school districts in the nation, Baltimore, Maryland. And if I were to ask you to predict their achievement, many of you would probably guess that they're low achieving. And that prediction would be right if you were basing your prediction off of what we know about the correlation between high poverty students and student achievement. But in this case, you would be wrong, because these students are all performing on or above grade level. And actually, about half of these students are certified gifted. So in this way, my own personal narrative, my own story around teaching and around learning directly contradicts the aggregate evidence of what we know about student performance and student demographics. My experience and the experience of students and staff members at Sugar Creek Charter are really important educational narratives, but they're just that. They're stories. Yet right now, stories, anecdotes, narratives, outliers, should this be what's creating our public policy? Every person in this audience has their own education narrative. Some are based on personal experience, some are based on media reports, many of them are based on Hollywood characters like Joe Carter in Lean on Me or Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds. And the most common narrative is that if there is an adult in a child's life that cares enough, then that student can make it. In our community, education reform is a priority, yet our reform discussions are more centered around these compelling narratives, these stories of outliers, than they are fact and evidence. Money is a key narrative in every community, ours included, and the story is typically divided along two lines. One, schools don't have enough money. Two, they have enough money, but they don't use it correctly. And I would argue that this only tells part of the story. But to tell this story, I'm going to use an analogy that isn't quite education related. The relationship between money and happiness, something that all of us can relate to, right? So researchers have actually been thinking about this topic for a really long time, and they've got some good evidence to suggest that the relationship isn't a direct correlation. There isn't a rise where the more money you have, the happier you are, but there is a relationship. So if the typical American is making $75,000 to $100,000, they should be pretty happy. But when you get past that point, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So it's important more about getting to a certain level than it is to maxing out the amount of money that you're making. And I bring this up because this is actually a very similar relationship between per pupil expenditure, or the amount of money that we spend to educate one child in 1 year in a school, and student achievement. So Washington, D.C. has the highest per pupil expenditure in the United States. They spend about $19,000 per student per year. This is in contrast to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. Here in our community, we spend about $8,500 per student per year. Nationally, this number has changed quite a bit over the years. These are inflation-adjusted numbers. So in 1949, we spent about $1,600 per student. 60 years later, we are at $11,000 per student. So we have a six-fold increase in per pupil expenditure, but no evidence that the achievement gap is lessening in any way. In addition, this six-fold increase has not yielded a six-fold increase in student achievement. So is money the key lever to closing the achievement gap? Probably not. But we do know that money is important and that there is a level you have to get to, a certain funding level. And we also know that different schools have different levels. That bar that you must reach, that $75,000 to $100,000, that's different for every school. So we know that segregated schools are the most expensive schools. And in our community, we actually use a weighted funding structure where we recognize that students who live in poverty have different educational needs. And so we compensate for that. This has received national attention as being an equity-driven innovation intended to close the achievement gap. So this means that we have schools in our district that cost more than $13,000 per student. Yet we have Other schools, mostly in the suburban areas, mostly white schools that spend less than $5,000 per student. It's a pretty large disparity. Yet, even with this additional funding, 2 to 3 times the funding, we don't see a big change in outcomes. And this funding has not closed the achievement gap. Arguably, though, if we didn't have this weighted funding structure, the achievement gap would be much bigger in these schools. So this funding structure is very important. So we're putting money towards something that has never worked for the majority of children in our district. Yes, amazing school leaders like Cheryl Turner at Sugar Creek Charter are doing amazing things for the educational trajectory of her students. But of the 141,000 kids in our district, are they having that experience? And what about those students that are stuck in these perpetually low-performing, high-poverty schools in our district? Our community is also committed to the graduation rate, which it should be, by the way, because based on the 2010 cohort, only 44% of our black males are graduating. This is compared to 71% of our white males. So nationally, there are some pretty good models of some districts that are doing a good job with these numbers. So if we look nationally at large school systems, the best school system in this area is Montgomery County, Maryland. They have a 74% graduation rate for black males and a 91% graduation rate for white males. So Montgomery County, Maryland is known for 2 things. One is high per pupil expenditure. So they spend a lot of money per kid. Second thing they're known for is a voluntary school assignment plan that encourages diverse schools. They have no concentrated schools of poverty in Montgomery County, and they have no segregated schools. In contrast, 42% of our schools are concentrated schools of poverty, with 90% plus of one race in the school. So, and what does our community do with reforms towards closing the achievement gap? We pour more money into the schools with the lowest graduation rate. So here again, we have the same narrative, the same story, funding the same policy, giving us the same results. Nationwide, we know that the only time the achievement gap has lessened in any measurable way, on any aggregate level, was during the 70s and 80s, during the height of desegregation efforts. So there's a policy that works, diverse schools, but because of the disconnect between the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that media tells, that Hollywood tells us, that policy isn't even on the table. My own personal experience as a teacher coach, as a school leader, my own personal experience tells me that a kid can be poor, can come from a recent immigrant background, can speak a different language at home, can be black, can be brown. A kid can have challenging demographics and still be very high performing. But my experience as an educational researcher tells me a very different story. It tells me that schools with concentrated poverty are not good for kids and not good for teachers and not good for our community. So we know it doesn't work. We know it's worked in the past. So why aren't we doing it? Well, I would argue that it's because complex problems rarely have simple solutions. And that the complex solutions in front of us are very hard. And because of the stories and narratives that we tell ourselves, we would like to think that the solution is simple and easy, right? All you need is a baseball bat like Joe Carter and some awesome cowboy boots like Michelle Pfeiffer, and bam, student achievement. But we know it doesn't quite work that way, right? See, we interact with the world and we have intuitive feelings about everything we encounter. We form opinions immediately. And most of these opinions and these really strong feelings, they're not based on fact or evidence. We all suffer from something researchers call confirmation bias. We have a thinking spotlight, so to speak, where we have an idea, we look around, we find evidence, and that evidence proves the idea that we already had, and we all think we're brilliant. Has anyone ever done that before? We rarely move the spotlight around, but on that rare occasion where we move our thinking spotlight around and we come across some kind of evidence, or we come across something that contradicts what we think or what we believe, something that's really right here in our belief system, what do we do with that evidence? We disregard it. I am very guilty of this. I come from a long line of opinionated people. It is the Hawn part of Hawn Nelson. So I came into my graduate studies with years of experience in school environments. And at a lot of different school levels. So I came into my graduate studies, and I came in there knowing I knew what was up and why. So I came in and I wrote some papers, and I had an idea, and I found sources to back my ideas up, right? I had a 3-page bibliography. But the problem was that my sources weren't good. They were there, they were in print, not on the internet. I did not cite Wikipedia, but they were not good sources. So the problem was I had to go beyond seeking reassurance, and I had to actually find evidence and fact. And it was hard. And I had to change a lot of my views. Every researcher struggles with this, or every research should struggle with this, right? Every person struggles with this. We are all human, which means we are all biased. And the problem additionally is that confirmation bias can be very scientific. You can prove most ideas you have with some kind of evidence. So take the idea that kids in concentrated schools of poverty can learn at a high level. I've seen it. I've done it. I know what the kids look like. Those smiling faces, they're forever imprinted on my memory. Or maybe people in this room, maybe you haven't seen it. Maybe you haven't done it like Cheryl Turner. But maybe you really want it to be true. So individuals join in policy debates. They join and they're thinking and they're feeling about things. And oftentimes these thoughts and these feelings, they're not based in reality or fact. So we make decisions based on belief, maybe even a belief from pop culture that sneaks into our consciousness, like all a kid needs is a Superman. When we know that what a kid really needs is food, a safe home, a healthy school environment, and a good teacher. So this is how we have a disconnect between educational policy and educational research. And actually, the research around diverse schools is surprisingly consistent. Using advanced statistical modeling, researchers have figured out a way to track individual students. And you can look at students within classrooms, classrooms within schools, schools within communities, and they can prove through some very long mathematical formulas that diverse schools are better. They have better educational outcomes. They're better for every kind of kid. Rich kid, poor kid, white kid, brown kid, black kid, all kids. And what's more, they learn essential skills, like how to work with someone who's different from you. Diverse schools are healthier work environments. That means that there's better staff retention, and you have an overall higher teaching quality of your staff. And lastly, diverse schools are cheaper schools with better long-term outcomes for the entire community. But the problem is that all of our educational reforms are based on making segregated schools work or work better. One writer calls this the triumph of hope over a mountain of empirical evidence. So we know that creating diverse schools is hard, but having schools that are separate and unequal has proved impossible. But going forward, all of us have a role to play in helping this disconnect between policy and evidence. Number one, demand evidence-based decision-making. Number two, want diverse schools in Charlotte? Great. Try to get your kids in diverse schools. Advocate for them, but don't blame the school system. They don't make the policies that create segregated neighborhoods, that create segregated schools. And our own school district fought against the end of the desegregation plan that our district was under from 1971 to 2001. Want to go a step further? Support affordable housing. That's where segregated schools come from. Want to go a step further than that? Live and choose to live and work in diverse areas. And lastly, and this is the most important, this is the takeaway that I hope you get from this talk. Acknowledge bias. Push up against it. Do something every day that challenges your belief system. Think about the talk. Maybe you don't like some of the things I said. They probably challenged some things in you. Great. Fact check me. The web version of this article is on the web. All of my citations are there. Go to the Urban Institute site, find it, look through it. Don't like something I came up with? Challenge me on it. Engage with me. In your own thinking, I encourage you to move around your own thinking spotlight. Do something, challenge your own biases. Engage with people that have totally different thoughts and belief systems than you. What does this look like? Have coffee with someone who voted for the other guy, or watch Fox News and MSNBC. The great thing is that as Charlotteans, we have a model of what a community can do to achieve something that everyone says is impossible. Not long ago, politicians crossed party lines. Community leaders and business leaders and public officials worked together to do something everyone said couldn't be done. This was 1984, and Charlotte was a national model of what we could do when we went past our individual biases to do what's best for kids. This was the year I entered kindergarten. I was a beneficiary of diverse schools for 13 years. And it is my hope that one day soon, our community will move again to community building rather than community dividing, and make policy decisions based on what we know rather than what we think and what we feel. Thank you.